Okay, welcome to Chapter 27, Objective 3B, where we talk about the regulation of the female reproductive system. Now, this one's going to be a little bit longer than the male, so let's go ahead and get started. I encourage you all to take a look at the video that has the handout associated with it from Armando Hasudigan. He does a fantastic job visually explaining the graphs in the female reproductive system. Okay, so just reminding you all how this all started, very similar to what we talked about previously in video 3A with the male. The hypothalamus is going to secrete the hormone GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That is going to target the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to cause the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which is then going to target the ovary. So you've got that female HPG axis. HPG is hypothalamus pituitary gland gonads. So again, you can see the gonadotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus, which is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete LH and FSH, which is then going to target the ovaries and cause the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, which, if you notice, is a little bit more confusing than the male. We have got positive and negative feedback going on here. Estrogen can inhibit, but it can also promote the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Estrogen can also inhibit or promote the secretion of hormones from the hypothalamus, that gonadotropin releasing hormone. We also have inhibin we're going to talk about, and progesterone. So a few more hormones involved. And you're like, well, how can estrogen inhibit and cause the secretion of, FSH and LH, and what's going on there? It has to do with the concentrations of the estrogen. So it depends on if concentrations of estrogen are low versus high as to whether they will prevent or cause the secretion of the next hormone. So again, keep in mind, these are hormones. They're going to travel by way of the bloodstream to reach their target. Once they get to the anterior pituitary, the GnRH, it will cause the secretion of FSH and LH, which will again travel by way of the bloodstream, target the ovaries, and result in the secretion of estrogen and progesterone being released. And we will also mention inhibin a little bit later on. Now, what you have here, again, I encourage you to watch the video so you kind of understand a little bit of this, but we're talking about day 0 to day 10. So if you remember your menstrual phases or the phases of the female cycle here, you're in the follicular phase. So day 0 to day 14 was ovulation. So day 0 to 14 is your follicular phase. Now, within the follicular phase, if you remember, it was broken down into two parts. The first 7 days was the menstrual phase of that follicular phase. So if you notice what's happening during the first 7 to 10 days here, we have gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is being released. So notice the curve going upward here. This over here is your hormone level. So we've got an increase in gonadotropin releasing hormone being released. Now, based on what we previously saw in our chart, we know that if gonadotropin is being released, we would anticipate that you would get luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone being released from the anterior pituitary. But look at what happens. It is not causing a change in luteinizing hormone. So you have some, but it's not causing an increase. And look what happens. You have this little spike in follicle stimulating hormone, but then you have a decrease. Well, that's kind of going backwards than what you would think. So again, why are the levels of follicle stimulating hormone and not increasing since the levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone are increasing? Again, that's not exactly what you would expect. Well, take a look. We've got estrogen that is also going to play a role in whether that is going to be released or not. So we have a new player involved. So let's take a look at what's happening. Follicle stimulating hormone initially rises. So you've got this little bump right here, follicle stimulating hormone, and you've got a page in your handouts. I suggest you all follow along and write that, draw those lines on that page. It's around page 234 in your packet. So I suggest y'all kind of write those graphs down so you can kind of follow as we're going through this. So again, you've got that spike in GnRH, but if you notice, you just have a little blip with follicle stimulating hormone, and then luteinizing hormone stays consistent. So you've got that initial rise. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to enter the ovary by way of the bloodstream. We already saw that it can do that on that previous picture that we did back in the objective 2. And that's going to stimulate. The presence of follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the follicle to mature. If you notice the name, follicle stimulating hormone, that makes sense. And it's going to cause that primary follicle to mature into a secondary follicle. The maturation of the follicles results in the production of estrogen. So those follicles produce estrogen. So while estrogen levels start out low, as that follicle matures, those estrogen levels are going to increase. So estrogen starts off in low concentration during those first 10 days. This inhibits the secretion of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. So low levels of estrogen prevent luteinizing hormone from going up, even though you've got gonadotropin releasing hormone that is going up. That's why there's a steady level of luteinizing hormone in the blood during the first 10 days. So it's almost like in order for luteinizing hormone to be secreted, you're going to have high levels of estrogen and GnRH. You have the GnRH, but your levels of estrogen aren't high enough to trigger that production of luteinizing hormone. So during the first 10 days, gonadotropin releasing hormone is causing the anterior pituitary to secrete luteinizing hormone, but those low levels of estrogen are inhibiting the release of luteinizing hormone. So you have this interesting interaction here going on. One of them saying, hey, secrete it, and low levels of estrogen are saying, hey, don't. The low levels of estrogen win in this fight, okay? So it's going by those low levels of estrogen. Now, estrogen in low levels is present in the body due to the maturation. So where did this estrogen come from? It's coming from the maturing follicles. And as the follicles mature, the estrogen levels are going to go up. So when estrogen levels rise and they get to that higher point, that's when the follicle stimulating hormone falls. So let's go back to this previous page right here. So again, you've got your gonadotropin releasing hormone that is rising, but it's not doing what you would think it would do because we have low levels of estrogen presence here. So estrogen levels are pretty low, so that's going to allow that follicle stimulating hormone to allow to be secreted. But as the estrogen levels rise due to the presence of that maturing follicle, you can see the follicle stimulating hormone is dropping off. Remember what follicle stimulating hormone does? It causes the follicle to then go from a primary follicle and mature to a secondary follicle. Well, you don't want all your follicles to do this. You only want a few of them to do it, right? Because you only have a certain amount of follicles that you're born with. You don't get any more. So this is what causes only a few follicles to mature into secondary follicles and not all of them, because once it recognizes, hey, we've got follicles that are maturing, they're starting to secrete estrogen now, we don't need follicle stimulating hormone anymore. We did our job. We at least got some of those follicles to start the maturation process and mature into secondary follicles. Now, luteinizing hormone, again, those estrogen levels are not high enough to cause a spike in luteinizing hormone at this time, okay? So, estrogen function. You've got your peripheral effects. We'll talk about the target effects here in just a second, but the peripheral effects, not the ones directly related to egg production and maturation and ejection. We'll talk about that in a second. But the peripheral effects are stimulates bone and muscle growth, stimulates endometrial growth. That is that inside lining of the uterus there. So estrogen is going to stimulate that inside lining to thicken, responsible for female secondary sexual characteristics such as maintaining glands and breasts. Okay, so now let's take a look at what's happening between day 11 and day 14. Keep in mind we are still in the follicular phase right here. Okay, we're still there. We're still in this day 0 to 14 zone. So As estrogen, I know he kind of spells it with an O, and that's fine. Estrogen levels are going to start to rise due to the maturation of that follicle maturing. And then take a look. I mean, they're real at that. As that follicle matures, you're creating more and more estrogen to enter into the bloodstream. So as estrogen levels are going to continue to rise due to that developing follicle. Remember, it went from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle. Since estrogen levels are now high, so take a look, those estrogen levels are high now. That's going to cause the anterior pituitary to secrete that LH. So we've got high estrogen levels and high GnRH levels. So notice our luteinizing hormone is just going to be level. And then with the increased presence of estrogen and the high levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone, all of a sudden now that luteinizing hormone is going to be released from that anterior pituitary, and the levels are going to shoot up. They're just going to skyrocket. It's going to cause them to spike. Now, luteinizing hormone is going to trigger the release of the most mature follicle, known as an oocyte or an egg, from the ovary. So that is what triggers ovulation in day 14, is that spike in luteinizing hormone. So if you remember our picture from before, we've got our primary follicle here. Notice our blood vessels allowing that follicle stimulating hormone to enter. It's going to cause that primary follicle. So we have our follicle stimulating hormone, which is causing our primary follicle to go into a more mature follicle, and that presence is again showing up in the bloodstream from the anterior pituitary. Now, as that growing follicle matures, it will secrete estrogen. And that presence of estrogen is what's going to cause the release of luteinizing hormone. So you're going to get this luteinizing hormone showing up as well from that capillary. Now, that luteinizing hormone presence is going to cause that ovulation to occur, and this is due to that high spike in luteinizing hormone. So now we're at day 14. Once ovulation has occurred, meaning the egg has been ejected from the ovary, you're left with now an empty follicle, and that is called the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum will then be absorbed back into the ovary. It's not going anywhere. So after ovulation, obviously the luteinizing hormone levels are going to drop, and the gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to drop. That's again letting you know, hey, quit making luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. We don't need those hormones anymore. We've ejected a mature egg. So when the follicle releases the egg, the empty follicle is called the corpus luteum. Now, it's going to degrade over the next 14 days, but it's not just not doing anything. Take a look at what that corpus luteum secretes. It secretes inhibin, estrogen, and progesterone. So that corpus luteum is going to secrete these three hormones. So day 14 through day 21, this is called the luteal phase. So we've got the follicular phase, which is going to occur from day 0, which includes menstruation, to day 14. That menstruation happens from day 0 to 7, okay? Now, the luteal phase after ovulation is going to occur from day 14 to day 28. And this is because you've got that corpus luteum, which is secreting hormones during that time. So look at what's happening. Because of the corpus luteum, right after ovulation, you have got progesterone. Take a look at that. That is increasing over time. Estrogen, the primary follicle has been ejected. So it is no, I know that estradiol, we're going to call it estrogen, is going down. So that estrogen level is going to go down because you've ejected the egg, but the corpus luteum is going to keep those estrogen levels. It's going to kind of cause that estrogen to come back up again. But take a look, luteinizing hormone is going to back off, and follicle stimulating hormone is going to back off because gonadotropin releasing hormone is no longer being secreted, okay? So the rise of inhibin inhibits the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. We don't want any more follicles coming along because we're still dealing with the one we just ejected, right? Estrogen levels are cycling, but they're still high. So the most important hormone is this progesterone right here. What does it cause to happen? It is actually inhibiting gonadotropin releasing hormone being stimulated from the hypothalamus. So if we have no gonadotropin releasing hormone, that means we don't have any luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone. Even if we have estrogen, remember, in order for luteinizing hormone to be secreted, you had to have high GnRH and high estrogen. So even though our estrogen levels might be saying, hey, you can secrete luteinizing hormone, our lack of gonadotropin releasing hormone is causing that to be prevented. Okay, so you're not getting any luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. This is going to stimulate that endometrial growth. Remember that high estrogen also is going to cause the endometrium to thicken. So that way, if the egg implants by a fertilized sperm, which happens in the ampulla of the fallopian tube, it will have a place to implant. If no fertilization, then that endometrial lining will shed, and that is going to be called the menstrual phase. So that's why it goes back in cycles at day 0 again. So the corpus luteum is going to continue to degenerate. So remember, we've got that corpus luteum right here, which is secreting that progesterone, that estrogen, and that inhibin. And then it degrades over time. So about halfway through, you've got that corpus luteum degrading, and as it degrades, it's going to stop stimulating hormone release, right? It's going to quit doing that because it's kind of deteriorating there. So once that happens, the lack of progesterone, because as your progesterone levels start to fall, that means the endometrial lining will start to shed. So the lower your progesterone levels, that is going to create menstruation to happen, where that endometrial lining is going to shed. So low levels of progesterone are going to go back up and cause the gonadotropin releasing hormone to be secreted. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone will then be secreted from the anterior pituitary, and the cycle begins again. You've got this page in your handout as well. It just shows you the days of the menstrual cycle. So we've got our first 14 days right here, which is your follicular phase. Our day 14 through day 28 called the luteal phase. So you can see right here, which is happening in the ovary. Kind of a summary here. You've got that primary follicle turning into a secondary follicle until ejection occurs. That's called ovulation. And so what are the hormones happening during that follicular phase? Well, if you look at your follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, you may need a highlighter to show the difference, because again, they're not, they're going to come out black and white on that handout. So I apologize for that. So that top one is going to be that follicle stimulating hormone, and that dark red one is going to be your luteinizing hormone. And look, that luteinizing hormone is going to be pretty level. And then due to that rise in estrogen, which is this one right here, that yellow one, that rise in estrogen along with the gonadotropin releasing hormone levels being high, it will cause that luteinizing hormone to spike, which causes ovulation to occur. And then the luteal phase, this is the corpus luteum right here, it is going to degenerate, but as it degenerates, initially it's going to cause a little spike in that estrogen, but it's certainly going to cause a bigger spike in that progesterone level. And then you can see right here what happens with the inside lining of the uterus. You have the menstrual cycle occurring at the very beginning, the first 7 days of the follicular phase. And then you can see after ovulation has occurred, that endometrial lining is going to thicken and continue to thicken. And then once the progesterone levels drop, it will then start back over again and shed back off. So I encourage you all to, again, watch that video that Armando Hasudigan has made to kind of represent that. He does a fantastic job drawing all of that out. You know, my artistry skills are not that great, but he does an absolutely fantastic job. So that's going to conclude chapter 27, Objective 3B.